Hi, welcome to Universal Interiors. I'm Les Ingelstead along with my friend and camera lady here, Raina Zima. We are very excited. We are doing a series on Imagine Heaven. We're interviewing John Burke, the author, and today you get the second interview. And if you haven't had a chance to hear it yet, you can catch that up on Lakes TV3 and just go to the website and hear last week's. But today, again, we're going to learn a little bit more on how to imagine heaven. Enjoy.
And this has been highly documented now. I mean, there have been 900 scholarly articles written on this. For instance, in the Lancet, which is like the Journal of the American Medical Association for America. The Lancet is kind of that for Europe. And in that medical journal, they talked about a patient brought into a hospital in Holland who was completely unconscious for no heartbeat and had been that way for a while. Brought him in and they were going to shock his heart, and they found he had dentures. And so they took his dentures out, and a nurse put the dentures in the lower drawer of a crash cart. They shocked his heart, ventilated him. His heart started beating again, but he never became conscious in the ER. They moved him out into another room. A week later, he comes to in that other room. And not only was he able to describe everyone operating and working on him in the ER, which nurses and doctors were in there, what they look like, but he was able to tell them where they could find his lost dentures in the lower drawer of the crash cart where that nurse had put them. And those kinds of stories are so common that it's convinced many doctors who thought that when the brain shuts down, it's just lights out. It's just game over. And yet it convinced them, no, life continues after death. And so I talk about that and what the evidence is that has convinced so many skeptical doctors.
Right. You mentioned Dr. Jeffrey Long quite a bit throughout this, and he was an incredibly bright fellow that went in to tell us about the statistics you carried on. Like, out of these, the detailed areas, 75% of the people were separated from their consciousness. They almost all experienced that. They experienced heightened senses. They encountered the brilliant lights, all of those things. There were so many that all these people, I mean, it didn't matter where you were interviewing. Like India, there was another study. Wasn't there like 500 over there and 500 in America, and yet they shared about the same?
Yeah, and that's what I'm trying to show as well in the book, is that really across cultures, the experience is very similar. The commonalities are very similar. And I talk about a study done with 500 Americans and 500 Indians to see what kind of, cultural or religious expectation might shape the experience. And what you find is it does shape the interpretation many times of the experience, but it doesn't change what is reported, and what's reported is incredibly common. And I'm trying to show that really is, if you really look at what the Bible's been saying through the prophets and through Jesus all along, it's laying out what people are reporting. That's what we would expect. And trying to show how those two come together, and how really, the message is that God created us for life with himself, and he really wants us to be there with him. That is, and it changes our view of this life when we start to see, why is this life the way it is? And how is it going to resolve? And I think that's really the hope that you get through Imagine Heaven, as you read it, is you start to see that, okay, there really is a bigger picture and a bigger purpose. It kind of is like Paul says in Romans 8, that this life is like the birth pains of, it's like a birth canal into life. And there's a lot of pain in that before you enter into life, right?
Yes. 3 moms here agree.
Yeah.
I'm excited about you being a skeptic, only because you are trying to find holes, really, is kind of what you're doing. And that is, for those of us, my husband is a skeptic, and so I get where you're coming from that, and I'm always trying to, come on, that's not, have a little bit of faith. So that's refreshing to know that you come from that spot, just so there's a little bit of a, you can see, what's the word I'm looking for? There's a, what do you call it? Like a battle between, okay,
Sure.
Are you sure this is real? Okay, well, now check this out. That's
And that's how you wrote. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I tried to write it. Now I'm a pastor, so I'm convinced.
Right.
But I wasn't always convinced, and I'm trying to lead people along who aren't necessarily convinced to see the things I've seen. And again, because I think it brings so much hope to this life, and it makes sense of so many things when you start to see from a bigger perspective. It's kind of like in one of the chapters I write on suffering, and if there is a loving God, how could he allow so much suffering? And when you hear through the eyes of people who have suffered so much in this life and then died and came face to face with this God of love and light, who knows them better than they know themselves, who loves them like they've never been loved before. And in his presence, there is understanding that they didn't have before. But I liken it to, when my daughter went through, my daughter, when she was 5, she fell and cracked her head and had subdural bleeding, so bleeding under the skull, which the doctors told us if it pressures up, it will kill her. And so we had to inject her with dye, and they had to do, CAT scans, MRIs, all that to make sure she wasn't going to die from this. And, the shots hurt her and terrified her. And then they had to do it again several days later. And when she realized, my 5-year-old daughter realized they were going to do the shots again, she was so terrified, and she screamed, "Daddy, don't let them hurt me. Don't let them hurt me again, Dad, please." And she's crying, and I want to protect her. I want to stop them from hurting my little girl. And yet I knew I've got to let her go through this. And then the worst part was the doctor said, "Dad, you're going to have to hold her down. She's squirming too much." And oh my gosh, I'm holding my little girl down. She's looking up into my eyes, pleading, "Daddy, why are you doing this to me? Why are you letting them hurt me?" I'm bawling. She's bawling. Why would I let her go through that suffering, and why would I suffer with her? Well, it's because I knew that there's something much worse that could come if she doesn't go through this, but there's something much better, and I want to live with her for a long time, and I'm willing to suffer with her for a short amount of time to live with her for a long time.
Beautiful.
And I think that is the perspective you start to understand and see too, through Imagine Heaven, and the hope that God has laid out for us of a very real life with real people and a real place, more real than we can understand on this earth. And that's commonly what people talk about.
John, the one thing, that kind of floored me too is how long people have been experiencing these. I mean, I look in terms of maybe 200 years, but obviously it's been going on since the Bible. But even in the 1800s, you shared a story about that. And that is something that, this has been going on a long time. Yeah.
Yeah. And I talk about how, for instance, Plato talks about the soldier from Ur who dies and is on the funeral pile and comes back and talks about what he experienced in the afterlife. Paul in Acts chapter 14 is stoned to death, dragged out of the city, and left for dead. This is the Apostle Paul, who wrote a good chunk of the New Testament. And yet it says that he got back up. he gets back up and goes back into the city. He talks in 2 Corinthians 12 about himself, and he says, "I know a man," he's talking about himself, "who, whether in the body or out of the body, I'm not sure," because he still felt like he had a body. But he said, "I was taken up to the third heaven, and I experienced things that are inexpressible." And Paul is talking about, and he talks about this. He says, when we leave this body, this tent, we still have a body. And he talks in 1 Corinthians 15 about the spiritual body that we'll have, that is a body of it's sown a natural body, it's raised a body of power. There's new experience. There's new power to it. And that's what people commonly say. They didn't just have 5 senses, they said it was more like 50 senses.
You know, Les, one of the things that I really enjoyed about this section of our interview is that he talks about how this goes across cultures and religions. And, you know, one thing for me, I've been a believer for many years, but I always hoped what I was believing was real, and I was always afraid that it was going to get disproven, or, you know,
Right.
I was scared. But after reading this book, I'm 100% certain that this stuff is real, and just going across cultures was another thing that just is like another check mark in the,
Right.
okay, it's believable. And that's, researchers have kind of tried to see is this just a Western culture thing that have kind of grown up in the Christianity,
Right.
you know, stuff. But Steve Miller researched and tried to do non-Western versus Western culture, and he found all the common Western elements in the non-Western experience. So let's say in the India religion,
Right, Hindu.
they're not finding any of those gods in these people's near-death experience. They're seeing beings of light and a man in a white robe.
Hard to explain that, right?
It's great.
Yeah.
I just encourage you all to read this book.
Yeah, and continue listening. This is just really amazing. When another thing that he was speaking of in the new body towards the end of the show here, and can you imagine that? New body, rid of these pains, your aches, all your little troubles that you continuously sorrow over. But God wants us there so badly. He has an amazing hope that we can understand what heaven is like. He is for us. You see, he's not against us. He's not trying to make it hurtful and painful here on this earth. Never does. He might allow it, but ultimately it's for his good. And he can't wait for his children to get to heaven. And this is what this man researched for 30 years to get this together, to come into a place, and now we get to present it to you, and hopefully you can read the book. But continue watching, please. We've got a lot more in store. Have a great week.